you agree with the president who says repeatedly, has been saying for 2 months emphatically now, if we don't fight them there, we'll have to fight them here?
I think we're better off empowering Iraqis to take care of the al-Qaeda inspired elements on the ground in Iraq today. I think it's likely that there are folks that have been inspired by al-Qaeda's in Iraq's behavior in Iraq, or that have even been in Iraq with al-Qaeda in Iraq, that are now outside of Iraq in a place like Lebanon or Syria or elsewhere in the Middle East.
My fear is that the so-called al-Qaeda-centric approach, Al-Qaeda-centric approach, Bill, is to lump all activists and militants together as Al-Qaeda. And since 9/11 in particular, the Al-Qaeda-centric approach has really basically become the dominant model in the United States among some of us who work in the field.
That it's all Al-Qaeda all the time.
Well, Al-Qaeda in Iraq does exist, and we know there are some major differences between the leadership of the Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Al-Qaeda Central. I would go further here and say that, in fact, while we have Al-Qaeda Central, and I have some Al-Qaeda affiliates, it's Al-Qaeda ideology that's resonating in the Arab and Muslim world and in some communities elsewhere. And that's what we need to focus on, Al-Qaeda inspired ideologies.
If you put that ideology on a bumper sticker, what would it say?
It would say that the West is waging a war against Islam and Muslims, and it's your duty to stand up and fight this particular aggression against Islam and Muslims.
All right, but to try to state the administration's argument as I've been following it, the administration, the president is saying that, yes, we know we got a mess in Iraq, but if we leave prematurely, we'll create a new Afghanistan. If we don't stay and get rid of this ideological group of terrorists, Al-Qaeda, then Iraq will become like Afghanistan after the Russians left. It'll be a rogue state, and we will be dealing with Iraq as a terrorist.
Most of the insurgents and resistance fighters in Iraq have nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. In my interviews with the insurgent or resistance leaders in Iraq, basically they tell me Al-Qaeda is a liability. Al-Qaeda represents a liability. Bill, there's a civil war taking place today in Iraq between some of the Sunni tribes, Iraqis, and Al-Qaeda. And we are arming some of the Sunni tribes. And the larger argument about Iraq, in fact, if we succeed in convincing Iraqi public opinion, and the larger Muslim public opinion that we are genuinely, about leaving Iraq, this is where the beginning of the end of Al-Qaeda. That is, in fact, Iraqis are the only competent agents who can defeat Al-Qaeda. We are telling the administration, Mr. President, you have a larger problem on your hands. And the larger problem is that your strategy, by being in Iraq, you are fueling the insurgency in Iraq, you are providing Al-Qaeda with motivation, you are radicalizing mainstream Arab and Muslim public opinion. Convince them that we will be out in a year or two and we'll begin the process of fighting Al-Qaeda.
I don't disagree. The only solution in Iraq is a political solution. There is no
agreement between the Sunnis and the Shias and the other...
And between different Shia factions, between different Sunni factions, and it's absolutely true. I am more hopeful that however the United States leaves in Iraq, Al-Qaeda will not be able to build a base there, precisely because of what Fawaz was saying, that the Sunni community in Iraq wants nothing to do with them. These are people coming in, trying to tell them what to do, and they want to run their own affairs rather than have Al-Qaeda impose, or Al-Qaeda-inspired groups is probably a better way to say it, try to impose their vision of religious law.
What's your worst nightmare about the long run?
Well, I worry a great deal about the spillover effects of the Iraq War. I worry a great deal about the intensifying Sunni-Shia divide. Lebanon, Bill, now stands at the brink of a major crisis between the dominant Shiite community and the Sunni community.
But that existed before Iraq.
But the escalation and the intensification and the blood, the spilling of blood in Iraq has really poured gasoline on this particular sectarian divide in the Gulf, in Lebanon, even in non-sectarian states, in Egypt, in Yemen, in Jordan. In my interviews, even some radical Sunnis are telling me the Shiites now represent a more existential threat to the Sunni community than the Americans.
And again, that just demonstrates that this is a war for hearts and minds. It's not a shooting war.
So, you know, neither of you make policy, and I don't either, but what would you tell the president we ought to do? What do you think we ought to do now that we're in this swamp, this quagmire, this mess? I think
we have very few good policy options, and we're choosing the best.
Oh, thanks. That's a big help.
I wrote last summer, and I stand by it, that I think we need to be moving troops out of Iraq soon, and I think that what's very important in my mind, and this has been bandied about a little bit in the media recently, is that it's not good enough to leave 20 or 30,000 troops in Iraq. That's not going to do it, because if we haven't established an Iraqi government that can control territory on its own, then 20 or 30,000 Americans isn't going to be able to control that territory either, and those 20 or 30,000 Americans are going to remain a sticking point and a propaganda tool for al-Qaeda around the world. So I really worry about this option of drawing down to 30 or 40,000 troops. I think if we're going to draw down that far, you've got to go all the way. And what I was arguing last summer that I think still holds is if you're going to stay, you really have to go in with everybody.
What do you mean?
Well, I would say it's almost not an option at this point with the state of the military, but we would need 300,000 troops, something like that, to really impose order, and that's simply not an option at this point.
Bill, I don't think America's strategic predicament has just to do with Iraq. I think our strategic predicament is much greater than what is happening in Iraq. Extraction of American forces must be a priority, but we also need a grand strategy, a strategy that takes into account the multiple risks and the regional, trying to resolve regional tensions in Palestine, in Afghanistan, in Kashmir, and also begin to shift the tide against al-Qaeda. I mean, if we all say that this war is about winning hearts and minds, the question is, you need a grand strategy to basically hammer a deadly nail in al-Qaeda's ideological play.
But can you win a battle for the hearts and minds when people, Muslims, are united by essentially their faith, their scripture, and their perceptions of America?
Well, all the polls, all surveys show that Muslims believe that the United States is not there to promote democracy, is not to fight al-Qaeda, but rather to subjugate Arabs and Muslims. And this is why it's a priority now for American foreign policy to begin the process of extracting its forces from Iraq, of developing a complex grand strategy.
We teach our cadets at West Point, you know, we rely on Clausewitz a lot, the great Prussian military strategist. And he says the most important thing a commander has to do before going into a war is determine exactly what kind of war it is. And I'm not so sure we have done that yet in Iraq. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're having so much trouble. We still haven't figured out collectively exactly who we're fighting and exactly where we want to go at the end of the day. What does that look like? And it's very hard to fight and win that war if we haven't done those things.
To be continued. Brian Fishman, Fawaz Gergis, thank you very much for this very interesting discussion.
All right.